In that sense, I like the word of wisdom a lot. Like it's an easy entry point to explain my religion, and to communicate my faith with people. And I mean, I'm not saying coffee or tea in moderation are terrible for you, but I just like that being set apart a little bit. So,
Mm.
as a dyed in the wool Latter Day Saint, if they came out today and said we're changing the word of wisdom, it's principle based now, all things in moderation. I don't know if my observation of the word of wisdom would change.
Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores church history and the church's truth claims. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores the church's history and truth claims. And in today's episode, I'm joined by historian and BYU Professor Casey Griffiths. Casey, thank you for joining me again.
Glad to be here. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, I always love our discussions. And you're also a host on the Church History Matters podcast. And you've been doing a Come Follow Me series on Scripture Central as well on the Doctrine and Covenants, which has been great. We're going to be discussing the Word of Wisdom today. And in the car driving home, I listened to an episode that you and Scott did on the Word of Wisdom. And I'll probably link it in the description because you do a really good overview of the context, the content of the revelation, and then addressing some controversies as well. But I think we'll just dive straight in. So Joseph Smith received the Word of Wisdom revelation it was February 1833. Maybe you could talk about what was the context, sort of what was happening in Kirtland that led up to Joseph inquiring and receiving the revelation, and maybe also the broader context with the temperance movement, and maybe elaborate on that.
Yeah. So, I mean, let's start with the broader context just to begin with. The Word of Wisdom, Section 89, didn't really come out of the blue. There were large temperance movements in America that were talking about the dangers and evils of alcohol. These really gained momentum throughout the 19th century and kind of reached their peak in the early 20th century when prohibition is launched by the United States. For about 10 years in the 1920s, the United States prohibited the sale or manufacture of alcohol. So that's floating around out there. But there's also other things, like really Americans enjoyed their alcoholic beverages. According to some data, the average person drank something like 6 to 7 gallons of hard liquor per year.
Oh my goodness, gallons.
And so, yeah, the sort of thing you're supposed to, measure in ounces, they're consuming in gallons. Now, over the course of a year, and that might have had to do with, lack of clean water sources. But drunkenness was a major problem, and so there's concerns over that. The Word of Wisdom also addresses meat consumption, and meat consumption was a huge thing too that people were actually talking about, and that there were discussions about. There was this guy named Sylvester Graham, who had started a program basically to talk about reducing the amount of meat and eating more healthy. You might be familiar with graham crackers. Those are named after Sylvester Graham, and also discussions about whether tobacco was good, hot drinks, which in their vernacular was tea and coffee. So it's not something that is created in a vacuum. A lot of people are thinking about this, and where the church is located during this time, especially the church members that are in Ohio, they're kind of at the center of a lot of these temperance movements that are circulating around, and it's part of the discussion too. Now,
Right, so there's sort of a broader movement, and I might think that some were advocating more for moderation, temperance when it came to partaking of some of these things, and others were maybe advocating more for abstinence. I believe some were even saying that tea and coffee could replace the drinking of alcohol, while others were, suggesting to not drink tea and coffee. So I guess sort of depended on the group, but there is this broader movement discouraging partaking in some of these things.
Yeah, and so they're part of the conversation that's happening among members of the church. But the revelation itself, the only immediate context we have really comes from Brigham Young, who it wasn't actually there when the revelation is received, but he's familiar with everybody that's involved in this, and the context he gives is that in the section immediately before section 89, which is section 88, they are commanded to organize an adult education program, the School of the Prophets. They're going to be meeting in this little tiny room in the Newell K. Whitney store in Kirtland, Ohio. And this is what Brigham Young says. So he gives a discourse in 1868. This is his wording from the record we have of the discourse. He says, when they assembled together in this room after breakfast, the first thing they did was to light their pipes and while smoking, talk about the great things of the kingdom and spit all over the room. And as soon as the pipe was out of their mouths, a large chew of tobacco would then be taken. And he said the distraction of the smoke, and he mentioned the complaints of Joseph's wife. Brigham said, made the prophet think upon the matter, and he inquired of the Lord relating to the conduct of the elders in using tobacco. So it seems like tobacco was actually the noxious substance. And I should mention, even the sermons we quote from Brigham Young were written down in Pittman shorthand. Garrett Dirkmott told me a couple weeks ago, he's a historian friend. We did a little drive where we talked about the word of wisdom.
I remember watching that.
Yeah. So he mentioned that in the shorthand, we tend to blame all this on Emma. Like she didn't want to clean up tobacco juice, which is totally understandable. But in the Pittman shorthand notes, it says that Joseph and Emma were having to clean up the tobacco juice. And so neither one of them appear to have been fans of tobacco to begin with. And when they seek the revelation, it not only talks about tobacco, it talks about strong drinks, it talks about hot drinks, and then it gives a bunch of suggestions about how and what a person should eat. So not just don'ts, but there's do's in the word of wisdom as well from the time it's initially received.
Right. So some of the specific things that it discourages against is, like you said, hard liquor, tobacco, hot drinks. It does seem to permit, at least in the text of the Revelation, mild drinks, which would probably include beer. Wine is said that it's sort of discouraged, except if you make it at home, you prepare it yourself, or for the sacraments, and meat to be eaten sparingly. What's the wording in times of winter or famine?
Yeah, that's an interesting part of the Revelation, right? Is it does talk about meat, and it says that you should use it sparingly. And so some parts of the word of wisdom we've obviously really emphasized, and some parts not as much. A couple of weeks ago, another YouTuber, Pastor Jeff, invited me to come on his show and explain the word of wisdom. And I said, I'd be happy to. And then when I sat down, he said, and we're going to go through the text. And I thought, oh no, I'm going to have a lot of explaining to do because our practice today among Latter-day Saints is very different than what Section 89 describes. But it's a great way to illustrate the relationship between Scripture and policy within the church. So Scripture is very much a character of the time that it's given in. It has to be looked at in context. We have to understand the historical situation when Scripture has been given. And we also have to understand that the church is led by living prophets who take Scripture and create policy, which are the current guidelines for church members that are adjusted to their time. So Section 89 can be looked at a couple ways. It's a revelation that gives us the basics of our health code, but it's also kind of a historical snapshot of what was going on in the 1830s and what concerned them. And then it becomes the foundation that we use to build the current health practices of the church, the policies that modern Latter-day Saints follow. But policy by its nature is also flexible. And so the word of wisdom today looks very different than it did in 1833. And I expect that in, 2033 or 2133, it's going to look different than it does today.
Right. No, it's a good distinction because we have the scripture, we have the revelation that's canonized in the Doctrine and Covenants, but the way that we apply it or live it or practice it is not identical to what's in the revelation. And today we've been told to abstain from, smoking, alcohol, tea and coffee, but also drugs, which isn't really mentioned in the Word of Wisdom. And I believe as well, I remember you reading in the podcast that First Presidency gave out a statement, I think in the last couple of years, discouraging against vaping and coffee products and maybe a couple other things. Maybe talk briefly on that.
Yeah, Joseph Smith didn't foresee vaping. I mean, he was a prophet, but I guess he just wasn't good enough to know that someday we would invent battery-powered devices to spew hot steam into our lungs as a nicotine delivery system.
Which I feel were
And
really big a few years ago. I feel like I don't see
yeah,
them being used as much, but a couple of years ago, it seemed like everyone was using the
yeah,
daily.
it seemed like a great workaround to get nicotine, but to not deal with the negative effects of smoking. But it turns out that there's a number of negative effects that are just associated with nicotine in general, and spraying hot steam into your lungs doesn't seem like a good idea either. So, again, it's fully adjustable, and every once in a while, the leaders of the church will come out and make a tweak here or mention something that isn't there. Obviously, stuff like LSD isn't mentioned in Section 89 because it wasn't even known. I don't know a lot about the history of LSD, to be honest with you. If you know more,
Me
jump
not
in here.
overly either.
But I mean, that probably didn't exist at the time the word of wisdom was given, and so it's always going to be seen as something that's kind of adjustable. And some of the stuff and some of the adjustments come directly from the fact that conditions have changed. For instance, it mentions a few things like you're not supposed to drink wine, but you can drink it if you make it yourself. There aren't a lot of people that have the time and investment to make their own wine nowadays. And it's also not a good idea to drink any amount of alcohol. And so they've just adjusted that to total abstinence from alcohol. Like, I've never had a student say, well, what if I make my own wine, me and my roommates? Is that acceptable? Well, yeah. If you're strictly going just by Section 89, it's acceptable. But the policies in the church have been updated over time. So the one I always refer back to is August 2019. This is the latest policy statement. And it happened to come just after President Nelson became president of the church. It'd be interesting to see if President Oakes, because this statement is now 6 years old, looks at it and says, we ought to update the word of wisdom statement again. But it teaches principles linked to the word of wisdom. For instance, the policy statement says, church leaders have provided additional instruction on those things that are encouraged or forbidden by the word of wisdom and have taught the substances that are destructive, habit forming, and addictive should be avoided. So there's the principle, right? Anything that's destructive, habit forming, or addictive
Which could apply
should be
to
avoided.
the things which have specifically we've been told to abstain from. It could also refer to many other
Oh, yeah.
substances or food or drink that could be addictive or harmful.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, really, sugar could be destructive, habit forming, or addictive. And so if you're overdoing it there, you might need to be careful. It's funny because I was at a general conference for a different church a few weeks ago, and they were having a luncheon. And I came back, and as a joke, they had made me a cup of coffee and set it right next to my plate. And I sat down and they were like, we got you some coffee. And they all started laughing. And I was like, get rid of this coffee. What I want is a Monster energy drink or something like that, which I think has like 4 times the amount of caffeine that a cup of coffee does. And they were just bewildered by the fact that, I could get away with drinking a Monster energy drink, but coffee was off the menu for me. Well, that speaks to the principles nature of the word of wisdom. If you're drinking 6 energy drinks a day that have, 400 milligrams of caffeine, that might be a violation of the word of wisdom, but God does allow a little bit of agency when it comes to how we live it. Then the second part of the 2019 statement, they say, in recent publications for church members, church leaders have clarified that several substances are prohibited by the word of wisdom, including vaping or e-cigarettes, which we mentioned, green tea, and coffee-based products. They've also cautioned that substances such as marijuana and opioids should be used only for medicinal purposes as prescribed by a competent physician. So, yeah, I mean, under this current interpretation of the word of wisdom, theoretically, you could use marijuana if it was prescribed by a physician. And I usually tell my students, not your roommate who's going to med school someday, right? But a competent physician who says, this is something that might help you. So my mother-in-law had Lyme disease, and a doctor prescribed CBD gummies for her. said it was a little bit more gentle and might be better than the painkillers they were giving her, which were pretty harsh. And she struggled with that because she was an upright Latter-day Saint. She'd never used marijuana or anything derived from it. But she eventually reconciled and came to accept that, yeah, if a doctor is prescribing this, then I'm not abusing it. God put it here for a reason. I just need to be careful because you can go off the deep end when it comes to those kinds of substances.
Right. I think it was an important distinction you made between distinguishing between the text, the revelation that was received in 1833, what's in our scripture, but understanding that this is something that's sort of living, it's adjustable, it's dynamic. It makes sense that it could be adjusted according to the current day, the practical circumstances as well. So the practice that we live for the word of wisdom might be different to at another time. And I want to talk next about sort of the implementation of the word of wisdom in our history, because one of the very first criticisms that was said to me about in church history that kind of threw me for a loop the first time I heard about it was a family member telling me that Joseph Smith drank wine in Carthage
Yeah.
jail. And I remember the first time I learned that, I was like, what? I was like, no, he didn't. No way. Because he revealed the word of wisdom. He didn't drink wine. And I remember they showed me, I think it was John Taylor in the History of the Church. And he said that it wasn't for the sacrament, but to lift or boost their spirits. And at the time, that really rocked me whenever I was like 21 or a term missionary. But even in the Revelation itself, it says it wasn't given by strict commandment or
Yeah.
constraint. And throughout the 19th century, it wasn't strictly followed. It was more viewed as in moderation or counsel. Maybe you could talk about that progression, that journey, going from it being sort of in moderation or not a strict commandment to then why did it change and then become a strict commandment in the early 20th century?
Yeah, there's a lot of presentism sometimes in the way we interpret doctrine and practice in the church. And by that, I mean, we think that the way we do it right now is the way it's always been done, and that's the way it's always going to be. Like, I had a missionary on my mission do some mental gymnastics to say, well, Jesus didn't even drink wine.
Yes, I
You
heard that as well.
and I still have some members that come up and say, well, when it says he drank wine, it was non-alcoholic wine.
It was grape
And
juice.
it was grape juice, right? And I've been to Cana, where the most famous story of Jesus turning water into wine. They did serve us non-alcoholic wine there, and that is entirely possible. But if it was alcoholic wine, that's okay. The health code that Jesus was living under is different than the health code we're living under. He couldn't eat bacon, for instance, but he could drink wine. We can't drink wine, but we can eat bacon. And I sort of think I haven't had wine, full disclosure, but I love bacon. And I think we got the better end of the deal as far as I'm concerned. Now, we have to do the same thing with Joseph Smith, too. But let me mention a couple things. The first three verses of the Revelation are the subject of a minor controversy with this, because often it was common when Revelations were placed in the Doctrine and Covenants for them to place a kind of prologue that leads up to the revelation. Some people that are very, very into the word of wisdom will say, well, the revelation doesn't even start till verse 4. That's where it says, thus saith the Lord unto you. And then he starts to explain his rationale that the not by commandment or constraint is in verse 2, which seems to be a prologue. Now, the counter argument is to say Joseph Smith canonized the whole thing. So he wanted all of it to be in the Doctrine and Covenants, including the first three verses. So his interpretation must have been it's not to be given by commandment or constraint. And that should be kept in mind when we're looking at how Joseph interpreted the word of wisdom. Now, it is true that on at least three occasions I can think of, Joseph Smith consumed an alcoholic beverage. One was Carthage jail. That's usually the first one people hear about. But also when Joseph Smith escaped from Liberty jail, he said that they were traveling cross country and they were famished, and they ran into a farmer who offered them some wine, which they drank. The other one, there's just an entry in Joseph Smith's journal in Nauvoo where he says, I went and got a beer with brother so-and-so,
Yeah, I remember reading that.
which I guess you could work out under mild drinks or something like that. But we just need to keep in mind that, one, they're not interpreting the word of wisdom the way we do today, and that's all right. It was a different situation. And two, Joseph Smith himself, addressing this, stated that there would be adjustments to the word of wisdom as it moved forward. So we've got to put him in context the same way we would put Jesus in historical context too. Joseph Smith is living in a world where alcohol is mostly manufactured at home, where it isn't like the world we live in. I mean, you could probably take $20 or pounds, if you prefer, and go down to a local store and purchase enough alcohol to literally drink yourself to death. That's just not the world that Jesus or Joseph Smith live in. And so the situation is a little bit different. The other thing is they use wine in sacramental services. Again, it's not manufactured or available in the kind of mass quantities that it is today. And so a little adjustment is probably okay. The other common explanation I've heard given, and no less a figure than Brigham Young and Joseph F. Smith have said this, was that the Lord actually gave them time. Like he kind of let them ease into full
I've heard that as well,
abstinence.
because so many people were struggling with those
Yeah.
habits with alcohol, smoking, that if it was a strict commandment straight away, none of them would have been able to adhere to it. So I've heard that as a possible explanation why it was sort of a gradual sort of, I guess, solidifying of the word of wisdom. Because my understanding is I've read quotes of Brigham Young where he's almost been softer, lighter on the older generation, but the younger ones trying to encourage them to not grow up and to follow the word of wisdom quite strictly.
Yeah, here's Joseph F. Smith. So this is from Conference Report 1913. This is right when the word of wisdom is approaching complete abstinence from alcohol, tobacco, coffee, tea, harmful drugs. He says the reason undoubtedly why the word of wisdom was given as not by commandment or constraint was that at the time at least, if it had been given as a commandment, it would have brought every man addicted to the use of these noxious things under condemnation. So the Lord was merciful and gave them a chance to overcome before he brought them under the law. Later, it was announced from this stand by President Brigham Young that the word of wisdom was a revelation and a command of the Lord. I desired to mention that fact because I do not want you to feel that we are under no restraint. We do not want to come under condemnation. So again, he's saying, yeah, it was eased into basically, but now he's approaching, 100 years. I think it had been 80 years since the revelation was given when he makes that statement. And he's saying basically, we've had plenty of time to get used to this. And I'm telling you right now, as the president of the church, it is a commandment, and you'll come under condemnation if you've made covenants and you refuse to live this commandment. At the same time, too, he's not the prophet that actually ramps up the word of wisdom to where it is now. It's Heber J. Grant. It seems like, from what we can tell, there wasn't any kind of enforcement for living the word of wisdom. It was just seen as good and a commandment. But there's plenty of commandments that we just really don't enforce. It's when Heber J. Grant made observance of the word of wisdom part of the temple recommend questions that it seems like it became a normative behavior for active Latter-day Saints to not use anything, to completely abstain from the substances that are mentioned in the word of wisdom.
And it's been that way since then. In order to join the church and get baptized, you have to commit to follow and live the word of wisdom, abstaining from those 5 main substances, and as well to get a temple recommend today. So one question someone might have is, if the revelation initially said not by way of strict commandment or constraint, and it's interesting that you said that in the 1833 Book of Commandments, it was included. And then I think I remember on your podcast, you said in 1835, that was almost separate, like that little prologue part. So like, is that part of the revelation? But certainly the interpretation that Joseph Smith had and the way the saints practiced it, in the early 19th century to mid 19th century was by moderation. It wasn't a strict commandment. But some might say that why should it be allowed then to have been made a strict commandment, or did the prophets that followed Joseph Smith, they had that authority to then make it a strict commandment for the saints?
Yeah, that's what I would say is that the successors to Joseph Smith have the same keys and the same authorities, and they have the right to make adjustments to the word of wisdom. Like they have today's news today. The revelation is foundational, but its interpretation and the policies that the church follows come from the current leadership of the church because they're living in the same time frame as us and have the keys to say, yeah, we need to do this or we need to do this as they move forward. So, I mean, I'm totally comfortable with that. I'm totally comfortable with the idea that Joseph Smith drank wine. At the same time, the records from Joseph Smith's time clearly indicate that excessive drinking and abuse of these substances was considered to be a pretty serious thing. Like
I'm breaking
we
the word of
have,
wisdom, like
yeah,
getting
we
drunk.
getting drunk. We have a tons of records of people being, say, excommunicated from the church for excessive drunkenness. And Joseph Smith actually had a brother-in-law who was married to his sister Catherine, who got brought before church leaders on several occasions for excessive drinking. So nobody should assume that Joseph Smith was going on like huge benders and that he was getting, completely drunk when he took these substances. In Carthage jail, for instance, John Taylor describes one bottle of wine, and there are 6 individuals in the jail. So 6 people sharing one bottle of wine doesn't indicate excessive abuse of alcohol, or that Joseph Smith was completely drunk when they attacked the jail or anything like that. It seems like something that they saw as being used infrequently and in moderation as being okay. And then later on, the command became abstain completely from this because the circumstances changed.
Right. So the word of wisdom is often we describe it as the law of health or like a health code.
Mhm.
And whenever you look up, about alcohol or smoking or drugs, it's very obvious the medical consensus that those things are damaging for your health.
Yeah.
When it comes to tea and coffee, and that's often whenever we share with people, we don't drink tea or coffee, they're kind of look at you funny because everyone drinks
Yeah.
tea and coffee. With that one, it seems like the medical consensus that in moderation there isn't any health detriments, but they seem to be okay. And people might be puzzled why is tea and coffee why do we abstain from it when it doesn't seem like it's bad for your health in moderation? I guess what would you share with someone who feels concerned about that or feels like that part doesn't make sense, at least with our current medical understanding?
Yeah, my pastor friend that I told you I sat down with a few weeks ago, he just
Pastor
couldn't
Jeff.
wrap his Pastor Jeff, he just couldn't wrap his mind around that, right? Like he was like, I totally understand alcohol and tobacco. That seems obvious. And to be honest, most people that leave the church, at least the ones I know, usually still continue to abstain from alcohol and tobacco, especially tobacco. It just seems like
Yeah.
there's no positive benefits to tobacco that anybody can justify nowadays. Alcohol seems like it's sort of fun, but um, but he just said, so if I invite you out for a cup of coffee, I can't do that. And I said, I would come, I would get hot chocolate. And he just said, that's a hot drink. I don't understand where you're coming from here. Well, we need to put ourselves in historical context too, that in 1833, hot drinks meant tea and coffee. Like there's almost no other hot drink that's available to them. But it was an issue of discussion, and the church did clarify as well. So on June 1st, 1842, the church has a newspaper called the Times and Seasons that Joseph Smith is the chief editor of. So Joseph Smith may not have written this statement, but he was aware of it and knew that it was being published in an official church source. And it reads, again, hot drinks are not for the body or the belly. There are many who wonder what this can mean, whether it refers to tea, coffee, or not. I say it does refer to tea and coffee. And it seems like ever since then, hot drinks has just been assumed to mean tea and coffee. And we could do a little argument over what tea means exactly. For instance, the 2019 statement included green tea. But it's pretty clear and has been for almost 150 years plus that hot drinks means tea and coffee. Now, as to why tea and coffee are against the word of wisdom, uh, this is where faith comes into the equation. I don't know if I can give you a really good reason. It seems like energy drinks should be more against the word of wisdom if we're looking
Oh
at
yeah, like those
harmful,
monster
addictive,
drinks.
or habit forming substances, right? But some things the Lord asks us to do just based on faith. When I was talking with Garrett Dirkmott, the example he used was it doesn't make any sense that if you smear the blood of a lamb over the top of your door, you're going to be protected from a destroying angel. That just isn't a logical connection people can make. But that's the language that the Lord invokes in section 89, is that if you're obedient to these commandments, the destroying angel will pass you by. And so on my scale, I'm okay saying at the time, they were recognizing that alcohol was bad. There wasn't as much science that tobacco was bad. Later on, it became obvious that those things were bad. But if it's not obvious right now that coffee and tea are bad for you, I'm also willing to just say, hey, I'm going to abstain from this just because God asked me to, and not really worry that much about the scientific backing behind it. The truth is that sometimes God asks us to do things just as a test of faith, just as a way of saying, will you trust me on this and will you follow me? And maybe we'll find out something down the road about the harmfulness of coffee and tea. But if we don't, I'm still comfortable with the idea that some commandments are just to test obedience, and that's fine with me. I'm happy over here with my hot chocolate, which probably isn't that great for me either. But hasn't been prohibited by the Lord, so I'm gonna indulge a little bit.
Right. So I want to ask a little bit more about hot drinks. So some people might think that they can find some wiggle room saying like, oh, well, what about like iced tea or
Yeah.
cold coffee because it's not hot drinks. What would you say to someone about that? What do you think about that? Because they might say, hey, it's not, if it's not a hot drink, then I can still have it.
Yeah, I would say, we always try to find loopholes when it comes to commandments. And like I said, it's just clear that in the 1830s and in that subsequent statement made by the leaders of the church that hot drinks meant tea and coffee. And it doesn't appear to be the temperature that they were worried about, because there are other hot drinks that are okay. Some saints have taken it that far. Like I've read where George Buchanan, who was this British Latter-day Saint in the 19th century, was worried about the heat of his soup. Like he would let his soup cool down, so he was staying on the safe side
I
and not
remember that
consuming.
quote. And did he mention, was it hot cocoa as well?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Wait
So he took
until
it
it's
very
luke.
literally.
He took it very literally. I've never seen any church leaders since him say that the temperature is the problem, or above such degree Celsius is the devil's temperature, or something like that. It seems like the hot drinks in the Revelation is just a way of addressing tea and coffee, and not actually worrying about the temperature of the substance you're having. So iced coffee would still be against the word of wisdom. And the 2019 declaration that I read does say coffee based products. And so I've had students come up and say, what if I get like a bunch of coffee flavored ice cream? And I would say, I mean, I don't want to get too pharisaical, but is there coffee in that? The Lord's prohibition is on coffee, not on ice cream, not on hot drinks. It's coffee and tea. And so take that as it is. I've also had some people come up and say, well, maybe trying to rationalize scientifically the word of wisdom, it's that coffee has caffeine. And so
Yes, I want to
that's
bring that up as well.
yeah.
That's been a justification I've heard so much growing up. And even whenever I went to primary, there was a lot of people who would say things like, I was offered Coke, but I abstained because we don't drink coffee because it's
Yeah.
part of the word of wisdom. My family, we did drink it growing up. I was like, huh? I was like, that's kind of strange. But
Yeah.
then you're like, well, energy drinks or Coca-Cola or other products have high caffeine, but we're allowed them.
Yeah, I know people that have said like, well, what if I drink decaffeinated coffee? Is that okay? And I just kind of had to say it's not the caffeine, it's the coffee that's prohibited. My family was like yours, where my mom continually had a Diet Coke, still does to this day. Like that's just standard for her. She goes and gets a Diet Coke. And so when we ran into some Latter-day Saints that came from a different part of the country, and they saw her getting a Diet Coke, they were completely shocked. Like, I can't believe you're drinking caffeine. And then when I came to BYU, where I teach right now, there were no caffeinated beverages on campus. You could get a caffeine-free Mountain Dew or Dr. Pepper or Coca-Cola, but you couldn't get a caffeinated one. In fact, on BYU campus, there were only two coffee machines, and it was like a badge of honor. I have photographs of both coffee machines that exist on campus, just so I can show people my bona fides as a rebel. One of them's in our guest house where we have guests come, and the other is in our performing theater where a lot of times when a person's performing, they want to have a cup of coffee beforehand. So we indulge them, I guess you'd say, with our coffee makers. But again, caffeine isn't against the word of wisdom.
Right.
And BYU has changed its policy. In fact, the major movement at BYU started after Mitt Romney ran for president. In the States, there was a news magazine that did an entire hour focusing on Mitt Romney's church. So, members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And on that episode, they interviewed a nominally active member of the church who basically said, yeah, I'm not good with it because you can't have alcohol, tobacco, coffee, tea, or even any caffeine. And the next day, the church newsroom issued a statement just kind of responding to that. This is the statement. Again, it's from August of 2012. They said, another small correction. Despite what was reported, the church revelation spelling out health practices, Doctrine and Covenants 89, does not mention the use of caffeine. The church's health guidelines prohibit alcoholic drinks, smoking or chewing of tobacco, and hot drinks taught by church leaders to refer specifically to tea and coffee. So church actually issued an official newsroom statement saying, yeah, caffeine isn't against the word of wisdom. And that started a movement at BYU to where students were coming out and saying, well, why can't we have caffeinated beverages? And the leadership of BYU was saying, well, it was students that said they didn't want to have caffeinated beverages. This was back in the 1970s when the honor code was set up. There were discussions back and forth, and it's been almost 10 years, but I think it was 2016, 2017 that they decided to sell caffeinated beverages at BYU. And I remember the day it was announced, hearing about it and walking into the religion building, and there was already a group of religion professors sitting there with their Diet Cokes and stuff. So the first people to run out and get a caffeinated beverage were the rabbis, the religion teachers here on campus. So,
do you have any idea where that came from, that cultural belief? Because it seems to have been something that seemed to be almost like worldwide around the church about you don't drink caffeine, but I'm not aware of any leader specifically saying or giving that as an explanation. But I'm sure lots of people locally, and maybe it's just spread, but that was often given as the justification. But do you have any idea where that came from, about we don't drink because of caffeine and we should also stay away from caffeine substances or beverages?
Yeah, it seems like it's a difficult thing to trace, but if I had to trace it, my money would be on John A. Widtsoe and Leah Widtsoe. So it's kind of interesting because in the 1920s and 30s, when a lot of churches in the United States are anti-science, they're pushing back against evolution and early Earth creationism. Our church is totally the opposite. We have almost half of the quorum of the 12 apostles who are scientists. So half of them come from the University of Utah. James E. Talmage is a geologist, and Richard Lyman is a chemist, and Joseph Merrill is a physicist, and John A. Widtsoe is an agronomist. And it seems like Widtsoe, who was one of the most popular apostles from his day, he's a really eloquent speaker, and he writes just a ton of books, that Widtsoe kind of went all in on saying the word of wisdom is a revelation because it's fact-based. It's scientifically sound. And in searching for a rationalization for why tea and coffee were against the word of wisdom, John A. Widtsoe and Leah Widtsoe write this book where they say it must be because there's caffeine in them. And that's why coffee and tea are prohibited by the word of wisdom. And apparently, John A. Widtsoe really pushed the idea that we should eliminate all caffeine altogether, to the point to where there's an anecdote where he went into David O. McKay's office, David O. McKay's president of the church at the time, and said, if we're really serious about the word of wisdom, we've got to get rid of caffeine. That means coffee, tea, and then here's the kicker, chocolate. Like we can't have chocolate.
That's too far.
And I'm paraphrasing here, but apparently David O. McKay said, if I get a revelation, we'll do that. But
we'll see.
I appreciate your feedback. I'm not going to make that change. But there's all kinds of stories about
there'll
David
be nobody
McKay
baptizing and converting to this faith if we took away chocolate.
Imagine if missionaries had to sit down and say no alcohol, tobacco, coffee, tea, harmful drugs, or chocolate. Like we would. I might have a hard time keeping my family in the church if
Oh
they
yeah.
decided to do that. But just to illustrate, David O. McKay sort of pushed back against that. Like, there's one story told in a biography of President McKay that he was coming to a theater opening in Salt Lake City, and all they had was those cups that say Coca-Cola on them. And the owners of the theater were really worried, like, what if someone takes a picture of the prophet and he's holding a cup that says Coke on it. So they run around the city trying to find a cup that doesn't say Coca-Cola on it, and they can't find one. So they fill it up with Sprite or something like that, and they hand it to President McKay, and he takes it, and when they hand it to him, they say, "We're so sorry. There's Coke on the outside." He politely hands it back and says, "I don't care if there's Coke on the outside, but I want Coke on the inside." So they go and get him a Coke, basically. Like he just sort of deflated all their worries. And on another occasion, President McKay is at a reception and somebody brings in a plate full of rum cake, which has been cooked with rum. The alcohol kind of bakes out of it. But here's the prophet, here's a rum cake. President
What's he
McKay
gonna
walked
do?
over. He picked up a piece of rum cake and started eating it. And when everybody looked at him like, "What are you doing?" He looks around the room and he goes, "The word of wisdom is against drinking alcohol. It doesn't say anything about eating alcohol." And then he just finishes his rum cake. So there's been a push and pull, and as far as I can tell, it seems like it's mid 20th century when John A. Widtsoe is kind of really influential as a writer. And I've got his book on my shelf on the Word of Wisdom, and he goes really hard against caffeine and says, you know what, if the Word of Wisdom is against addictive substances, then caffeine is one of those. But the leaders of the church also decided, we're gonna prohibit these clear substances that have clearly been explained to be against the word of wisdom, and then we'll allow people agency. Because the other person that was really hyper about the word of wisdom around that time is Joseph F. Merrill, who is Widtsoe's fellow scientist. They both come from the University of Utah. Uh, Merrill was head of the engineering department there when Widtsoe was president of the U. But the thing that Merrill goes really hard after is meat. Like he gives a general conference address in 1945 where he basically argues that we should completely abstain from eating meat. And anybody that's been to a Latter-day Saint function will know that we don't really follow that. that
Especially
that
over
that
summer, we're having barbecues all the time.
yeah, we have barbecues, we have chili cook-offs here in the States. It's just not one of those things that we've chosen to give a major emphasis to. And so, I mean, again, it has to do with the presiding leaders of the church. Obviously, the first presidency sets the tone. But there have been different discussions back and forth, especially in the mid 20th century when we were starting to gain, like, we couldn't just observe that alcohol was bad for a person. Like, now we're starting to understand alcohol causes cirrhosis of the liver and that tobacco causes lung cancer. And they were searching for the same kind of scientific rationale for tea and coffee and for abstinence from meat that the others had. And to be honest with you, I'm not totally sure they weren't right about meat. Like, my doctor told me a couple years ago I needed to stop eating meat,
Particularly
or at
red meat.
least, yeah, or at least, eat it in small quantities and only in times of winter or something like that. But what the church asks people to do as a matter of policy is different than saying, here's the principles, what's harmful, what's addictive, what's habit forming, is something you need to think about. And while it's not a temple recommend question to say, do you eat an excessive amount of meat? It's a question that maybe we ought to be asking a little bit more often. The other thing that I've wondered too is when it talks about meat, it says in times of winter or famine. And I've also said, well, in the 1830s, they didn't have refrigeration technology. So the Lord saying, don't eat meat except in times of winter may have been a way of warning them that, it spoils, which they knew. They knew that meat could spoil. But today it seems like
We can
that
preserve it
actually,
more.
yeah, it seems like that's actually good counsel to say that you should eat meat sparingly, but we're not going to make it a requirement for a person to get a temple recommend. And so it remains one of those things where it is wise. It's part of the word of wisdom, but not a requirement, strictly speaking.
And what's your thoughts on if the church potentially could, in the future, adapt or soften the word of wisdom? I think we've seen a little bit of that with, like the Strength of Youth booklet. It's been more focused on the principle versus, specific rules about like only having one earring or no tattoos or a certain length of clothing. It's more focused on the principle and, that famous statement from Joseph Smith, I teach the people correct principles and they govern themselves. And some people wonder, like, yeah, we could still live the principle of the word of wisdom, still follow it as a guide to health and looking after your body and trying to avoid harmful substances. But in the future, could the church soften to where maybe tea, coffee, and alcohol aren't strict abstinence or forbidden, but encouraged in moderation? What do you think are maybe the pros and cons of that possibly happening? Do you think it could happen? Would you like to see it happen? Because I can think of some positives and some benefits to that. But what do you think about that? That maybe in the future there could be a softening or lessening or going back to, oh, well, the original revelation says not by way of strict commandments, and we're going to let you govern yourself on this principle.
Yeah, I mean, could it happen? Absolutely, right? The historical record, the way the word of wisdom has been interpreted, shows that it's adaptable, and that, I mean, when we say could they soften, I mean, I would argue that in some senses they have, in that it used to be pretty standard. I've even seen some places where church leaders would say caffeine, is dangerous. I've never seen a place where they've said it's against the word of wisdom, but I have seen discourses, talks from church leaders in the 70s where they said it's addictive, and so let's avoid it. Whether or not it should happen is way above my pay grade. Like, I don't get to make those decisions. If you're
Not yet.
asking
Maybe one day.
for my if you're asking for my personal proclivities, I can't see any reason why alcohol, tobacco should be allowed in any amount of substance. It just there's no health benefits to tobacco. There just aren't, in any way. And I grew up in a family where there was a little abuse of alcohol, not among my immediate family, but among some family members, and I've seen how difficult that can be, all the problems that it causes. And so, even if the church relaxed its stance, I would probably always be in favor of, I personally
Abstaining.
completely abstain from alcohol. When it comes to tea and coffee, I haven't ever had those, so I don't know what the great benefits are.
Coffee's
um,
nice.
coffee's nice. Okay, it seems like I know a lot of people that are fans of that, but again, that's up to the leaders of the church and what they see as their interpretation of the word of wisdom. I will say that it's interesting to me that I spend a lot of time with other restoration churches. So your listeners probably know that there's a number of churches that trace themselves back to the Book of Mormon and Joseph Smith. When I said I went to another church's general conference, I just barely went to the general conference for the Church of Jesus Christ, also kind of known as the Bickertonites. They're the third
Oh,
largest.
yes. Josh Gailey's a member of that
Yeah,
church.
Josh Gailey
I love
actually
Josh.
invited me. Love Josh, great guy.
Yeah.
And it was interesting because they don't they kind of follow an 1830s interpretation of the word of wisdom. So they drink coffee. They're the ones that made me coffee at the gathering. And Josh told me, I don't drink often, but he went to Ireland last summer, and he was like, when I was in Ireland,
You
I
have
had
to.
a pint. I had a pint of Guinness. Like, I felt obligated to. And it turns out I was in Ireland at the exact same time. I also went last summer, and I felt, a desire to completely abstain. Like, I'd probably never get a Guinness. So
It tastes
uh,
horrible, so don't blame me.
yeah, so it could it possibly change? Yeah, and a lot of people have pointed out that the recent Strength of Youth pamphlet that sort of directed people to be more principle based, to say, here's the rules, and here's the principles. Use the principles to create rules that work for you, is entirely possible. At the same time, too, it's hard to see much change happening. Especially because some of these things seem so obviously bad. And I'll say this too: the word of wisdom is also probably the thing that sets us apart most among Christian faiths. So usually, when a Latter-day Saint introduces their faith to someone, it's a word of wisdom situation. And for me, there's been multiple occasions where I've gone to a conference and had to explain, no, I don't really drink coffee. It's part of my religion. Or no, I can't go get a beer with you, but let's go get lunch together or something like that. I think it's a great introduction to the faith.
Or even
And
just
I
with work
probably,
colleagues or in any non-church
yeah.
function, especially for me over in the UK, you're always being offered tea or coffee, or I play tennis and some of the guys are like, oh, let's go out for a beer after, and they always look at you strange. We're like, oh no, I don't drink, or oh no, I actually don't drink tea or coffee. They look at you like, that's kind of peculiar. So it does
Ah,
definitely set you apart.
it sets you apart. Like a story I always tell is I was on this trip to Taiwan when I first got here to BYU. I got a little travel budget, went to a history conference in Taiwan, and we're riding on a bus, and they stop and they pull over and they get some of these nuts on the side of the road, and I had no idea what they were. That they were betel nuts, which is kind of a mild narcotic that's popular in that part of the world, and so they start passing it back, and everybody starts taking some and putting them in their mouths. And when it got to me, I reached for one, and this little Japanese guy sitting next to me, who barely spoke any English, actually grabbed my hand and said, Mormon, no. And I go, oh, am I not supposed to take this? And he goes, Mormon, no, eat. And there was another professor on the bus from who was a Latter-day Saint, and I said, "Are we not supposed to have this?" And she yelled back and said, "I won't tell anybody if you want to have some." And I said, "Is it a drug?" And she goes, "Yeah, it's a mild narcotic." And so I put the nuts back and I turned to my little Japanese friend and I said, "Thank you." And he just said, "Moment, no eat." And that night we went to a Taiwanese fishing village where their main product was millet wine. And everybody on the bus got completely drunk. And me and Hiro kind of set off to the side. We had difficulty communicating, but I got enough out of him to find out that he had been an exchange student in the States and that he'd lived in Idaho and that he'd lived with a Latter-day Saint family. So he protected me essentially. And that was a case where he was aware of our beliefs and that allowed him to allow me to be set apart. So in that sense, I like the word of wisdom a lot. Like it's an easy entry point to explain my religion and to communicate my faith with people. And I mean, I'm not saying coffee or tea in moderation are terrible for you, but I just like that being set apart a little bit. So
Mm.
as a dyed in the wool Latter Day Saint, if they came out today and said we're changing the word of wisdom, it's principle based now, all things in moderation. I don't know if my observation of the word of wisdom would change to a large degree. Maybe I'd go get a coffee just to see what it's
Just to
like,
try it.
and then probably never get it again because it doesn't seem that great. To be honest with you, I think I'd probably still be a hot chocolate guy myself.
Mm. So I want to ask just a final couple of questions in wrapping up. So one, often, we point to the word of wisdom, the revelation, especially when it comes to abstaining from alcohol and tobacco, that this is, really strong evidence of the prophetic nature of the word of wisdom and Joseph being a prophet, because it wasn't until, well, like 100 years later are we starting to learn from science about, the negative effects of, smoking causing cancer and the liver damage with alcohol. But then some, critics might point to that if so many of these ideas were in the milieu of the time, in sort of the temperance movement, does this undermine the prophetic nature of the word of wisdom? And does this show that it's really just a product of its time and it's based more upon the science and understanding of the day than, 100 or 200 years in the future? What would be your response to that?
I mean, I have no problem with revelations being spurred by scientific discovery, right? Science is one of the tools that God has given us to investigate the universe and to live happier and healthier lives. So if I found a source that said, well, Joseph Smith was reading, a pamphlet on the dangers of tobacco and alcohol the day before he received Section 89, it doesn't change Section 89 from a revelation at all. Like often we come to the Lord with the idea, and then he gives us a confirmation. And it seems like, based on the context we have, they were at least sitting there thinking, tobacco is gross. What is the Lord's opinion on this? So, yeah, revelation doesn't come in a vacuum. And I believe that scientific findings are another way of discovering truth, just like revelation is. So they're linked to each other. I'll also say this too. For me, maybe the most important part of Section 89, the part that I think about again and again, is verse 4, where the Lord contextualizes the word of wisdom. He says this: Behold, verily, thus saith the Lord unto you, in consequence of evils and designs which do and will exist in the hearts of conspiring men in the last days, I have warned you and forewarned you by giving you this word of wisdom by revelation. And then he starts into wine and strong drinks and tobacco and hot drinks. He's basically saying this isn't a commandment for all time. It's a commandment for our time. It's a timely commandment because conditions are going to be different in the last days than they have been in previous dispensations or eras. And so it seems like the Lord is attuned to the idea that what we're facing and the challenges we're going to deal with are going to be different than someone that lived 2,000 years ago or however long ago, whatever era you want to assign. And when you start to look at that, the word of wisdom makes a ton of sense. Like he's not just warning us against addiction. Like sometimes I read this and say he is warning us against the dangers of exploitation, of capitalism run amok, basically, where a lot of advertising surrounding alcohol or tobacco or even coffee and tea is there to commoditize you, to basically get you addicted to a substance so that you become a reliable customer. And it's become more apparent now that we know what was going on in the tobacco industry back in the 1950s, where they were literally paying for false scientific studies that talked about the benefits of tobacco. And they were filming commercials where doctors were like, when I get out of surgery, the first thing I want to do is have a cigarette. When every doctor
Marvel
today
that.
would tell you, yeah, that's incredible. They were intentionally misleading people
Yeah.
to get them addicted to their products. And some of what we found out was that it wasn't to just get adults addicted to their products, it was to get people addicted when they were very young so that they would stay reliable, lifelong customers. And to me, that is prophetic. I don't know if Joseph Smith could have foreseen that kind of exploitation that's possible through the media and the tools that we have now that didn't exist back in the 1830s. So, yeah, science and religion have an interrelationship in my mind. They're both about the quest and search for truth. And the word of wisdom does demonstrate not only wisdom when it comes to substances that science says are bad for our body, but also the kind of exploitation that comes when people intent on making money find out that addiction is a really good way to make money. And if you can get somebody addicted to something, then you can sell your product and you can make a ton of money. And it doesn't seem like they're super worried about what the physical health consequences are going to be for people. So that to me is the most prophetic part of the word of wisdom. And the wisdom has been sustained in my mind again and again and again. I mentioned, there has been some alcoholism in my extended family. I still love all those people. Like they are my family and they always will be. But even as a young person, I remember seeing the effects of alcohol and thinking, this doesn't seem like a really positive thing. It doesn't seem like something that helps them grow and progress in their lives. In fact, it fuels dangerous behavior. Even just drinking alcohol is dangerous, but then combining it with driving, with firearms, with all the things that we have. I mean, in Jesus's day, if you got totally drunk, you were going to crash your donkey, right? You weren't going to drive a truck into a van carrying a family of six, which unfortunately happens as a consequence of alcohol use and abuse in our time. So I think the word of wisdom was really prophetic. And sometimes we get so caught up in the weeds of saying, well, it doesn't seem like coffee and tea are really that bad for you, that we don't back up and say, what a blessing it is that we have this to begin with. And how much does it help our lives? Like just as someone who's served in the church, man, if I could wave a magic wand and get rid of all alcohol today, I would do it. Because I just don't think it's got any positive benefits, to be honest with you.
Well, why don't we finish with that? What do you
Yeah.
see are some of both the temporal or physical health blessings of adhering to the word of wisdom, but also spiritual blessings, because the last few verses in the word of wisdom talk about spiritual blessings and spiritual promises. And the Lord says there's no commandment that he gave, which is temporal, all things are spiritual. Maybe finish on that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say too, I work among college students, and BYU has been voted like the number one dry school in the United States, I think for 22 years running or something like that. I'd have to look up the statistics. But among my students, I see those benefits. You know, I read a lot about college age students and the challenges that Gen Z and similar the people that age face. And one of them really is like binge drinking and alcohol. Among young people, you get a modicum of freedom because you've gone to university, and for the first time, your parents aren't there waving you off from dangerous stuff. And a lot of people just really overdo it and get into trouble. So for me, the blessings are really obvious temporally when it comes to the word of wisdom. When it comes spiritually, there's so many gifted people out there whose connection to God and their ability to feel spiritual promptings and just to use their intellect and the gifts that God has given them that unfortunately are blunted by substances like alcohol and tobacco. And don't even get me started on illegal substances like drugs. Like a lot of people talk about how marijuana is relatively harmless, but not among the people that I know that use it frequently. It seems like it really does impair their ability to progress and to grow. And maybe that's what they're going for. Like maybe they want to drop out and have a more relaxed life and not be part of the fast lane. At the same time, too, I'm not opposed to slowing down the pace of life, but chemically inducing a slower pace of life always seems like a bad idea. That commandments, in my mind, sometimes exist to grant us greater agency. And does the word of wisdom grant me greater agency to make decisions, to be aware and in control of my life, to understand where I'm going and to feel the promptings of the Spirit? Yeah, absolutely. Um, I, I I've never really seriously questioned the word of wisdom because it just always seems so smart to me. So I can't compare and contrast. You know, I never had a phase in my life when I engaged in binge drinking, but knowing people that I care about that have, I've seen the fruits of not obeying the word of wisdom, and I've seen the fruits of obeying it. And in my mind, it's such a blessing to us. Like I'm so grateful that we've been asked to live it, and I never felt any hesitation to talk to somebody and say, "Hey, your life would be better if you followed this commandment." I just believe that that's true for every person out there.
Awesome. Well, Casey, I've enjoyed this interview and this chat with you about the word of wisdom. I'll recommend people to watch the episode you did with Scott on Church
Yeah,
History Matters. It was quite a good deep dive as well. And go check out Church History Matters and Scripture Central. And if you've enjoyed this video, give it a like, comment, share, subscribe, and come
and
back for.
can I mention one more thing?
Oh yeah,
Um,
sorry.
just over in your part of the world, we do another series called Restoration Revealed, where we travel to church history sites and do some documentaries there.
Me and my
And
wife watch that every time one comes out on a
yeah,
Sunday.
yeah. We just had two episodes come out that we filmed in England a couple years ago. So
Oh,
we traveled up to Preston and saw the place where the first missionaries came, and we traveled down to Herefordshire and visited Gadfield Elm and some of those beautiful places where the first British Latter-day Saints came into the faith. And so I hope people will take a look at that too, especially your fans in the States who might not get a chance to go to England, but
they
also
can see it.
your fans that are local who uh, probably are already aware, but should know that church history exists everywhere. Like
Yeah.
going to England was such a great experience. We're hoping that we can start to do the same thing with other countries, but the history of the church in England is just so rich.
A lot of the
That
earliest converts coming
yeah.
from, Liverpool area and Preston area, the
Oh yeah.
northwest of England.
Yeah, such a wonderful group of people. The Ribble Valley, right there in northwest England, was rich, fertile ground for the early saints, and so I love those stories, and those videos are designed to sort of help people begin to explore the rich heritage of the church internationally, not just here in the States.
Yeah, and they're really high quality, good camera. You go to different church history sites, and they're relatively short, 15, 20 minutes as
Yeah.
well. So they're good consumable content. So yeah,
Yeah.
I'll encourage people to watch them as well.
Okay. And I'll encourage people to watch your channel. Thank you for all the good work you're doing. I really, really appreciate
Oh, thanks, Casey.
that,
That
that
means a
you're out
lot.
there putting out good, positive content too.
Thanks, Casey. Well, you take care. Take care, everyone.
All right.
See you later. Bye bye.
Thanks.
Thanks everyone for watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like, share it with others who might benefit, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can also listen to these episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Check out my website for more content, personal blog, and more. And if you care to donate to support me, you can via my PayPal or Patreon, or through the website. And you can also give donations via YouTube through Super Chats. Thanks for watching Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.